The time is just gone 5 minutes past 8 as we continue our broadcast Wednesday night with myself, Inayat Wadi, as we stay in the company of our viewers and our listeners here at Salam Media on the various platforms. Now, for the next hour, we will be focusing on Sri Lanka and raising the question, what is next for Sri Lanka? We all know what has happened in that part of the world, and at some point in time, we knew something had to give, because Sri Lanka has been under the radar for a very, very long time. And we're going to unpack some of these developments tonight. My guest tonight on the panel, Shashika Bandara, PhD student, Global Health Policy, McGill University. And we also have got Donovan Williams, social commentator, as part of the panel this evening. And to welcome both Shashika and Donovan to the broadcast tonight here on Salam Media. To both of you, good evening, welcome, and we thank you. We appreciate you for your time.
Thanks, Inayat. Good to join the show.
Thanks, Inayat.
Right, Shashika, I'm going to start off with you, Shashika. And obviously, look, we are not surprised as to what has happened in Sri Lanka. There have been many commentators that have predicted that something was likely to give in Sri Lanka for a very, very long time. And just initially to paint a picture, some sort of background, so that we can actually lead up to the discussion and unpack some of the other issues, and also looking forward as to what is next for Sri Lanka. Just your thoughts on what has happened until now.
I think Sri Lanka has been disappointed with the political leadership, but we were obviously, because of the policy decisions and the economic decisions that we have been facing over the years, and also especially during the last 2 years since 2019, people were really disappointed with the political leadership. I would call it political apathy, where the politicians did not care about the well-being of the people. Even at the worst situations of the crisis, they were looking after their political interests. And then I think largely Sri Lanka admirably led this peaceful protest through Gotago, Gama, and around the country. This is the first time where people came together, and it's important to recognize that all the ethnic groups, regardless of the populist narrative of the government and trying to divide people, came together and held peaceful protests. And as things got worse, the impatience grew, and as manipulations were more visible, people got more impatient. And even when the presidential secretariat was taken over, it was largely peaceful. And now things are taking a bit of a turn, especially as protesters move towards the parliament. So that is where we are right now. I would say the common ask of the people is the resignations of the Gotabaya Rajapaksa and then also Ranil Wickremesinghe, none of which has happened right now, and Ranil Wickremesinghe is the acting president currently.
Yes, Donovan, just your thoughts on what has happened in Sri Lanka. Now, this is clearly a case of a government that has failed its people. It has failed its people in more ways than one, on an economic level, on a social level, on a socio-economic level. And obviously, these are all triggers for what we have seen. We've seen the storming of the homes of MPs, the storming of the government as well, leading to the Prime Minister obviously fleeing the country. And something had to give at the end of the day, considering the conditions and what ordinary people were experiencing in the build-up to what we have seen happen.
Look, Inayat, currently, globally, we have a cost of living crisis, okay? And everywhere, there's no part of the world that is not affected by this cost of living crisis. But what is clear is that cost of living crisis is a lot worse in countries which have bad politics, which have politics and governments who do not put the people first in their needs. And clearly Sri Lanka is that. But those governments and those politicians don't come out of anywhere. They don't come out of nowhere. They're not imported into the country. They come from the very societies that are fed up with them. And they have been elected, they have been supported. And for Sri Lanka itself, that society needs to question itself, because the corruption and bad political decisions in Sri Lanka predates the cost of living crisis. When the Sinhalese majority had a problem with persons of Tamil origin, etc., then the corruption of the Rajapaksa government did not matter. And they were corrupt, and they were fascist, and they were authoritarian. But because it was directed at the LTTE and so forth, it did not matter. You had amazing stories come out of Sri Lanka of an editor of a very large newspaper predicting his death and saying that his death would be by Rajapaksa, Mahinda Rajapaksa, because he's calling out the corruption in the country. So when that was occurring, they taught their government, the Sri Lankan people, particularly the majority, taught their government that they can take them for granted. They can be corrupt and so forth because it doesn't matter. And that's led to this massive economic meltdown. A meltdown for various reasons. It's both policy, it's economic decisions, and there's lessons for us as South Africa, but I don't want to go into the discussion you had previously. But there are decisions that this government has made because it has been so used to ignoring the people, because the people allowed them to do whatever they wanted to, because they did it mainly towards people that they didn't care about. But of course, COVID, the Russia-Ukraine conflict played a role, but it is, in honesty, it is something to hide behind, because you have had a bad government, which was taught to be a bad government by the Sri Lankan people. Because the Sri Lankan people, is not just apathy, it's because it didn't matter to them. They weren't the ones feeling the brunt of the draconian authoritarianism of Rajapaksa.
Thank you for that, Donovan. And also now bringing Shashika back into the discussion. Now, we know, Shashika, that the collapse at this point in time of the current Sri Lankan government was long coming. I'm not surprised that this has happened, and for the reasons that Donovan spoke about as well. And also at the same time, when one looks at a government that has been irresponsible in more ways than one, and one needs to seriously think. And as Donovan mentioned, it is people that voted this government in. It is people that have brought these people into power, and it is the very same people that are now crying to take them out and to remove them from power. And just your thoughts on just looking at Sri Lankan society in general, and we've seen the anger, we've seen the reaction, but also just looking at society in general in terms of how they've perceived this government before this crisis had actually unfolded.
Yeah, I completely agree with Donovan. I think Sri Lanka needs introspection as a society, definitely. And I think in 2019, Gotabaya Rajapaksa was sort of propped by the 2019 Easter bombings that happened, and which really surprised the whole Sri Lankan community. But they also sort of maximized that and manipulated that to sort of drum up the ethnic divisions that was between Muslims and Sinhalese at the time. But as Donovan mentioned, the long-standing ethnic conflict between the Tamil minority and the Sinhalese, which has been manipulated by politicians, especially Sinhalese politicians, has been a problem in our society. And I think people sort of bought into the populist narrative of the Rajapaksas for so long, as long as it didn't inconvenience them. There was a minority in the majority population who opposed them, including myself and others, and many of the human rights workers. Their voice was heard, and I think that was one of the reasons why the Rajapaksas lost in 2015. Then this good governance administration also did not live up to its name, and disappointed the people who wanted a human rights-based society. And then the country went back to the Rajapaksas. So there is a definite need for us to introspect. But I also have to mention that within this protest, which is termed Aragalaya in Sinhalese, meaning that protest essentially, um, uh, that there is this big tent approach where where the protesters sort of actively work against these populist narratives and invite people into the tent. And I have seen Buddhist monks and Sinhalese people supporting Muslims as they broke fast during Eid. And also just today, I think a university student spoke to the whole protest crowd, a Tamil student, sort of pointing out what Donovan pointed out, like they have tried to divide us this whole time. It's time to introspect and change this trajectory.
And if I could just come in as well in here, I just want to come in because I want to take up what Shashika is saying, because it's very important. The one matter is, and this is the difficulty we have, that our nation states have generally been created through ethnic enclaves. But in the countries that were colonized, they were colonized by ethnic clans of Europe. So the ethnicities in our colonial countries weren't bothered. So they were just put into like a melting pot in some way or the other and hoped to get along. And we can see it on our continent in Africa, right? Countries were put together that weren't necessarily countries before that. So an inclusive society is very, very important for stability. So therefore to have development and so forth. That's the one part. At the second part is that, you know, if a government is buying arms because they have a conflict, the West doesn't worry. They literally don't, because you buy the arms from them. So when there was this conflict, the Sri Lankan government was a cool government because it was buying arms. It was buying tanks and whatever else and bullets and, you know, etc. And that works out nicely for Western governments. But when they don't buy from you, then there's a problem. So when you have to unpack this stuff about creating a new society, the one part is inclusivity. The other part is the failure of both capitalism and liberal democracy. That what we have seen, you know, post, you know, in other words, as globalization has occurred and so forth, we've seen the failure of establishment of democratic institutions to be able to represent the people. And so the people leave those institutions. They don't have the confidence in it, which allows populism to take root. And that populism is allowed by the West because you will go and buy from them. So even though Sri Lanka may have been buying via Chinese loans and whatever, it still didn't bother the West, because this is an economy, even if it doesn't support it, it can't afford it, whatever, you can buy stuff. And this is where the COVID pandemic has exposed us. The conflict of Russia and Ukraine with the COVID pandemic has exposed that our economies are integrated, have to be able to work with one another within a country and work with each other. And capitalism does not allow that. Capitalism is not allowing that completely. So is the understanding, are you going to have a socialist economy? Somewhere in this, that's the introspection. The introspection can't be just holding hands and singing Kumbaya, but how do we create a society that is able to take care of the least fortunate, not able to only reward those who are supposedly successful? And that's the difficulty we all have. And in Sri Lanka, it's coming to a fore, but it's going to come elsewhere as well in different ways. Maybe not in this way, but there is a definite failure of democratic institutions to be there for people. You can elect another person, but within this framework, it's not going to be able to provide the solutions. And then what do? Do you keep on having people rising up and chucking this one out till the end? People don't believe in each other at all anymore, and we are getting closer and closer to that. Sorry for interruption, but I just want to follow up what Shashika said because it was too important.
I think it was extremely important, Donovan, and that actually, in fact, was going to be my leading question, but I think you covered a fair amount of it. And just coming back to Shashika, where when one looks at the government of Sri Lanka, populism is one thing, and obviously looking at it internally, where they thrive on populism, where they thrive on division to get into power. But at the same time as well, it's about a political image externally to please the other major external players. And when one looks at what has happened at the Prime Minister at this point in time, because, in his build up to the election, he was talking about making Sri Lanka a 100% organic farming nation. He was talking about a green economy. He was talking about a zero carbon campaign. Now, all of that was in the build up to his elections to try and obviously create that image externally, and looking at some of the global players. But at the end of the day, both have actually failed him. Because on the one hand, coming through populism, and we've seen what has happened with the people, these are the very same people that have ousted him from power. When one looks at what has happened to Sri Lanka externally, the foreign exchange, foreign funds had actually dried up. So they couldn't pay for fuel. They couldn't, they had problems with energy. So in both instances, they basically, he's lost out. He's lost out majorly, I would say.
Yeah, I think just to touch on the green economy approach, I am for sustainable, approaches in terms of energy saving and farming, but I think it has to be a phased approach, and I think that's what the experts were saying. And Gotabaya Rajapaksa, for diverse reasons, implemented this ban on for chemical fertilizers, which was one of the policy reasons that we are in this economic crisis, along with the tax cuts for the wealthy and so on. So it has failed him, but I also think that his policy decisions as a president was really poor, whether it was his advisors or whether it was him, like, we don't know. But as a leader, he has to take responsibility. And one of the things I have noticed throughout, and there's a lot of sort of humor around this as well in Sri Lanka, is that whenever something fails, he does not take responsibility. He keeps saying, we are the ones who did it the best, and so on and so forth, as we are failing. So one of the reasons that we are in this situation is because of his inability to admit that he is failing, and being in denial to stay in power. And the other reason is that I think all of that government banked on populism and division, did not think that it would fail them. They started this committee of One Sri Lanka, headed by a racist Buddhist monk who has a very racist history, and kept him on the top of the task force, even when people protested. So these are some of the reasons that were very visible for the people to see that they do not care about them. And then it imploded eventually. And I have to say that this is a crisis for Sri Lanka, but this is also a moment of hope, because this level of push for change in a unified manner has not happened in my generation, in my parents' generation, probably not even in my grandparents' generation. So, we are really fragile right now, but in terms of the path we take for the future is really important, and there is a chance for us to move towards positive reform.
Yes, and also Donovan, you spoke about capitalism, and this is where the fundamental problem actually lies: is the system within which we operate, the system within which governments operate, the system within which governments impose on the people that they are governing and they rule. So fundamentally, this is where one of the major problems, and this we've seen this in the case of Sri Lanka as well. And I'm surprised that we know what is happening in India, populism as well. But there was the issue about the farmer strike that had taken place, but it hasn't got to the stage where obviously a person like Narendra Modi has now been removed from power, because we're talking about a similar scenario that has evolved in India. We know India is much larger, it's a bigger economy and the like as well. So possibly that could be the reason. But again, coming back to the system within which we are operating, and also looking at governments like the Sri Lankan government wanting change, but as Shashika mentioned, that should have been a phased approach. We're talking about things like pesticides, and we're talking about a green economy, we're talking about organic farming, all of that. At the end of the day, it's not something that you just wake up one morning and says, fine, this is the decision I'm taking, and this is exactly what has happened.
Yeah, but we've also done it, eh? Haven't we just said like, hey, no, we're not going to have coal, we're going to have renewables, you know, like in a sense, and because we are told that this is what you're supposed to do, and you want to give all the right, correct signals, and it sounds nice. It sounds like you are on the cutting edge, and so forth. You know, at the end of the day, Inuit and Shashika, we're in a crossroads as humanity, in many ways, and unless we change things are just going to get worse. And I think that's unfortunately where we are. And it's about the values that we seem to accept that are values. So for all our governments, and will make it seem that this capitalist value system, there's no alternative to it. You can't do anything else unless you play along within that value system. That value system, which is based on, and it's three of us as men speaking here, and I recognize that and I acknowledge it, but a value system based on urban chauvinism, complete urban chauvinism, where it is about a strong person as possible, and also our governments, in that there's no alternative, make it seem like they are powerless, that they can't act because we are going to be punished as a society by whatever other bigger power. And like we have no agency. They lull us into thinking that we can't really change things. We are part of this bigger world, etc. Now, in the case of Sri Lanka, one of the things that may need to occur, and in reality, is that who's going to solve the problems in Sri Lanka? On one level, it must be the people of Sri Lanka. But on their own, they can't do that. On their own, how are they going to do that? And there needs to be a regional, you have to take regional responsibility in Sri Lanka. And both India and Pakistan have to put aside their urban chauvinism for the good of the region. If India, with its own enmity towards Sri Lanka because of what happened with Rajiv Gandhi and so forth, the assassination, because of the conflict in Sri Lanka in many ways, etc., its own conflict with Pakistan and Pakistan's own conflict with, all those games need to stop. As much as Modi is this populist, fundamentalist, etc., and that, but how, or do we want the UN to come on behalf of the US or France or wherever else it is, to come and sort out Sri Lanka itself? Do you want South Africa or Australia and so forth? There has to be a regional approach to what we are going through, because if we do not have that, we are expecting countries and their people to sort out messes that are not just easily going to be sorted out. There will have to be new elections, whichever way or the other. There has to be elections. There may have to be another constitution, There has to be some interim type arrangement. But who brokers that? Do you let a far-flung UN do that? And the dangers with that is that the opportunity for those who want to exploit Sri Lanka will be taken up through maybe an Australia, because of the geospatial significance. So or geopolitical significance, sorry, not geospatial. So, these are the questions that this urban chauvinism that we deal with conflicts and we create governments out of are going to hurt us. It's hurting us already. It's made our institutions not do what they were set up to do. It's made political parties tend to be more worried about political parties than the people. They compete with each other, completely, in many ways, separate from society. Once an election occurs, they go back to their fights like we didn't matter. And this is the failure of capitalism and liberal democracy. This is why people can't be taken care of. You have, in the most advanced economies and democracies in the world, like even Canada, you have the same problems. You have the same problem. So for me, and I really think that Sri Lanka is not the poster boy or the poster, the best example of, the capitulation of bad economics and so forth and that, right? And it may not be replicated in the same ways, but the roots of the problem in Sri Lanka are global. They in every one of our societies in different ways, and colonial societies in particular, really, really in particular. And it's just that in Sri Lanka, you've had a complete meltdown of political leadership. Complete meltdown. It may happen with us because in our country, Shashika, there's a very, very low confidence in political leadership across the board, all political parties. But it's easy for political parties to blame the ruling party and the ruling party to blame with factions within it, right? But that's all talking to themselves. It's the elite talking to themselves. And unless our society changes from being elite-driven, and this is what Sri Lanka has gone through, elite-driven politics, elite-driven economic policies. I mean, all the stuff that they did in the north, the infrastructure that went into the pockets of the elites, all the stuff they built, all the, the huge ports and everything, which you would think that infrastructure-based development is the way to go. You would think that would work, right? It's a very left-wing way of doing things. But when it goes into the pockets of individuals and so forth, then it doesn't even matter how nice and good the cow train looks, our bullet train, Shashika. It doesn't matter how good it looks and how nice it works, because it doesn't really have the impact on the people that you wanted it to have. And that's what's happening with Sri Lanka today. I mean, the scenes are great and so forth. It's getting worse and worse. And it's going to continue to get worse unless there's a positive intervention. And the resignations is not going to be the only intervention that's required. Because with you've got to have some interim leadership in there. Otherwise, you're going to have the age-old thing of people fighting over what they can get.
Certainly, Donovan. And yes, Shashika, in fact, I think, talking about the interim arrangements and also looking at, a positive outcome. At this point in time, there's so many issues that Donovan raised. For instance, the role that and the neighbors, India, Pakistan, can play. And we know that, you will have those powers that will look at exploiting the situation in Sri Lanka for their own benefit and to the detriment of the people of Sri Lanka. And just to look at some of these regional players and the relationship that Sri Lanka has enjoyed, and more importantly, what sort of role they could play now that this country is in crisis.
Yeah, I think Donovan is correct. I just want to touch on the regional politics and the importance of regional unity, not just around resolving political crisis, but I think it's also important in terms of health and other socioeconomic conditions. So for an example, vaccine equity is a huge problem in the world. And, without regional cooperation and without regional blocs representing themselves, pharmaceutical companies and high-income countries can continue to manipulate the world and create these inequities. So I just want to add to that, to Donovan's point. In terms of Sri Lanka, India, Pakistan, and so on, I just want to notice the trend in the region that, so for an example, in India, this is happening, this anti-Muslim narrative that is going on, Hindus versus Muslims. And in Myanmar, we saw how Rohingya Muslims were blamed by the majority Buddhist community. And if you take Pakistan, there are the Pakistan, Bangladesh, there's also the other way around, the Muslim majority attacking the other minority. So from a human rights perspective, if I look at it, I would say there's a blueprint that these leaders share in terms of navigating or garnering this support through populist activities. And one of the ways is to create the other and then attack the other in their speeches and then move people towards that violence and all of that. And so I think regionally, if we are humanitarians and if we are working towards human rights, we need to recognize this manipulation as a regional problem and address that. That's one. And in terms of moving out of this challenge that Sri Lanka faces, I think just today, India did not allow Gotabaya Rajapaksa to land in their country when he was trying to flee the country. And many of the countries said no. US refused visa actually to Gotabaya Rajapaksa. So Maldives was the country that allowed Gotabaya Rajapaksa to escape, which in itself is questionable ethics on their part. So I think if we are going to grow as a region, we need to look at the challenges, the socioeconomic challenges, the challenges that harm our society as a collective, and try to address these things. I know governments might not do this because of the political benefit that they have right now through dividing society. But if we are going to push for change, that's one thing that we need to look at as communities. The other thing which complements this is the sentiments of the protesters in Sri Lanka, where they have recognized this and they have voiced this, saying, first, Sri Lanka needs to get rid of its executive presidency, which has unprecedented power to do essentially anything. And then also to look at ways how institutions can be reformed with better social protection and so on. And I just want to sort of ground that in saying that we have a very good low cost and high return healthcare system. We have a very good literacy rate. Our education system is good. Right now, all of that is suffering due to the economic crisis. But, people recognize the value of these things. And so to Donovan's point, communities are also recognizing these changes that we need to make, and to make these sustainable changes, not just cosmetically, but also in a way that it is sustainable.
Yes, I think you raised so many issues, and I think also Donovan, apart from the issue that Shashika has raised in terms of looking at the region as a whole, whether we look at India, we look at Pakistan, and even spoke about Myanmar as well, where we're talking about marginalizing of minorities and all the other ills that go with the persecution of minorities in those countries. But also, you raise this issue about the wealthy elite. And it seems to be a regional problem. We've seen this now in Sri Lanka. We've seen this happening in India, even at the time of the demonetization with the Modi government, where the wealthy elite had basically insight into what was going to take place. So basically, they came, their money obviously was safe, and it was the farmers and the millions of people that had basically lost rupees with demonetization. And also at the same time, we look at Pakistan as well. We're looking at those big landowners, the Sharif government, the Bhutto governments, and we see this over and over again playing out. So I'm not too sure, under these circumstances, whether these regions can actually play, or the regional countries can play a meaningful role in terms of stabilizing Sri Lanka and also assisting the country in getting out of this crisis mode.
Inayat, I think we would be foolish, okay, to say, for example, in our circumstances, South Africa, we go back to between 1990 and 1994, when the liberation movements unbanned, etc. We would be foolish to think that Mozambique and Zimbabwe and Botswana would be able to come in and put together a transitional program. It would be foolish. But we couldn't have Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Botswana, and countries that are involved in our economy, Europe, UK, France, the US, etc., be bystanders. They need to be supporters of something that we fashioned together to help us transition. And I think that's what I'm trying to raise. That you can't do away with the elites even in Zimbabwe. In Sri Lanka. You would need to have leadership to step up that is not just the leadership that are political. You would have to have leadership from business, from religious leaders, sports leaders, professionals, media. Come up to put together to say to the region as well as other powers, help us with the resources to stabilize this country. That we put together an interim government that can be able to fashion a constitution, that will be able to hold elections, that can be able to stabilize the economy. And that would mean some reprieve in terms of foreign currency, or they could be risky and say, okay, we're going to go for rubles, exploit the conflict between the US and Russia, but that may not be a way out. That is just fancy footwork. That may not help, because they have a foreign currency, complete meltdown in terms of they need dollars. And it's a dollarized global economy. That's a debate for another time. Right now, Sri Lanka needs to get food, to have not just, humanitarian aid by the UN, etc., but more than that, some little working type economy. And leaders within Sri Lanka need to come forward to do that. Leaders who are not trying so that they can show the people that this is just about stabilizing, etc. Sri Lanka needs that. That's what they need. They need that and get support from the Indias, from the Pakistans, from the Bangladeshis, from the neighbors, so that the IMF and the UN and the US, etc., all of them say, yes, we want to help. How can we be here? Because if you don't do that, you're going to have what we have like in Zimbabwe. When they had an economic meltdown, the currency has never recovered. The country is not recovered at all. There's little whispers, green shoots here and there, but it doesn't really get over it. And no matter which constitution you're putting and how many elections you're having, you still have a crisis of politics. So you would want somehow the Sri Lankan people, I don't know I've not been in Sri Lanka. I don't know the individuals. There may be Shashika, but there must be people who would be able, it's impossible with that high literacy rate and all of that, to be able to not have leaders who have the scruples to be able to come forward to say, no, we've got to arrest the situation. We've got to do this. And the people generally will listen. But if not, that vacuum will be taken up by those who just want to exploit. And I think that's what I'm trying to say when I talk about the elites are a problem globally. The elites, be it through the oil industry in Saudi Arabia or the US, wherever they are a problem. But elites do not operate in vacuums. They operate because, as in societies, we have become selfish. We are selfish with one another. And this is what the opportunity, and that's why Shashika was saying earlier, that what this crisis does. It's an opportunity to create a better society. A society where no one can come just divide you amongst religion or ethnic groups or whatever. You have a fundamental bind with each other to do good for the country. Something we've lost in our country in many ways.
Yes, Shika, just looking at the capacity, the leadership capacity, I mean, because right now there is a leadership vacuum in the country. Can that leadership vacuum be filled, and are there people capable within Sri Lanka, which will bring some relief? I wouldn't say get the country out of the crisis completely, because there are just far too many problems, and obviously compounded by, as Donovan alluded to, dollars, foreign exchange, and all of those type of things. And there you're going to require obviously some external interventions, for want of a better term. But just within Sri Lanka, what capacity is there?
I think there's capacity for leadership in Sri Lanka within the parliament. One of the challenges right now is getting Ranil Wickremesinghe to give up power. He has not heeded the calls of resignation. So today, I think all party leaders asked him to resign. He has not. All the defense leaders asked him to resign. He has not. So there is this challenge of getting a leader out, even to place another leader in the chair. And the other thing is that I think constitutionally we can have a president for the next 30 days or so, and then have an acting cabinet to sort of tie us through until we get to elections and so on. And I think it's quite important to have that, and the politicians have recognized that. So the first step is for Ranil Wickremesinghe and Gotabaya Rajapaksa to resign. And the next step is for political leaders to agree who is going to lead. And there are challenges there because everybody's ego gets involved and everybody's political capital gets involved. So there are challenges around that as well. But I don't want to name names because I'm not politically affiliated, but I think there is capacity within the parliament to lead us through this economic crisis, to make sensible policy decisions. And there are those who have spoken towards an inclusive, economically sound government consistently throughout the parliament in their policies and the way they have spoken. So there's definite capacity. And the other thing is, I think if we are going to do negotiations with IMF, which we have started, we definitely need to reach this political stability in order to have a working government to implement the changes that they speak about. So it's quite urgent, I would say, for Sri Lanka to recognize that we cannot play political games, especially for Ranil Wickremesinghe and Gotabaya Rajapaksa. And, in their case, in their personal case, to make these sacrifices and put the country forward, and for other politicians also to do the same. Yeah.
Yes, Shashika. And also, Donovan, in a situation like this, I think when we're talking about interventions, we're talking about urgent interventions because
Mm.
sometimes these matters are not treated with a sense of urgency, and the longer the crisis drags on, the worse it becomes. And it then opens up, for even anarchy to take place. And then you're talking about security apparatus getting involved. You're talking about people, taking the law in their own hands, and we've seen this happen. It's happened before. And this is an area that is risk. It is a huge risk and it must be identified. But more importantly, it needs to be recognized. And so the sooner, workable solutions are found, the better it will mean for the country.
Yeah, most definitely, and I think the Sri Lankan, there's a large Sri Lankan diaspora across the globe in very many pivotal countries, and I, you know, it is a tough time. I'm sure if I was out of my country and I saw my country going through such a difficult time, you can throw up your hands, you can feel very powerless, but you can help. I'm sure that diaspora can help by approaching the capitals within their country, so within the countries they are in, to make certain this becomes a matter in the UN Security Council, because it's and the UN Human Rights Council, because it's both a security matter and a human rights matter. That it's brought forward to be discussed. That's the first thing. Secondly, also in the region, I think the ASEAN multilateral body would be the correct body where it is discussed. That helps put the pressure on somebody like Wickremesinghe and so forth. But also for people to start preparing, leadership to start preparing, to know that this is not just going to continue like this, and they can just pick up the pieces in that way, to bring that responsibility that the world is watching you, not just jumping in the presidential pool and whatever else, but they are watching you. And the diaspora knows how to do those things. They have managed to get people out on the streets on different matters, and they need to pull those levers again. It's very, very important, especially for the humanitarian aid, that needs to go there right now. I mean, that must be the first response, that people shouldn't be starving. They shouldn't be going through what they're going through. And that has to be taken up. So for me, the diaspora is an element that has to be brought together, and they are organized. They actually are organized in different ways for different matters, and they need to show themselves and their loyalty towards their country in one way or the other, and not get involved in the different political battles that very often get replayed outside of a country. That's happened all over. It happens very often, and that's part of putting your country first. That's part of putting your people first. So I think that is something that needs to be done. And for the people, my suggestion is start having a discussion on the constitution. Start having those types of discussions, concrete change discussions. Otherwise, you're going to have, as Inayat says, you're going to have criminals and opportunists and stoking anarchy and whichever else. But there's only so much you can take before there's nothing left to take. And how quick that happens. Deterioration happens very quickly, and that has to be a facilitated process. I'm going to sound like a stuck record in that. The leadership, whatever broad leadership in Sri Lanka, must step up. They have to step up. You cannot be saying that Wickremesinghe is your only roadblock. He can't be. He took that position with all political parties against him. He agreed to be a prime minister with all political parties against him. So, really, no, he can't be. He can't be. You can't take control of this, and Sri Lankan people can, and we must support them. That's why the diaspora becomes important, to send those messages that Wickremesinghe must realize he's swimming against the tide of history, and others as well. Yeah.
Yes, and also I think, Shashika, just from what Donovan says, talking about Sri Lankans in the diaspora, but also at the same time the reaction from the international community, there has got to be a sense of urgency. And I think there have been great lessons from what we've seen, the hypocrisy of the international community. And I know Sri Lanka is a different scenario, but when one looks at how the Russian-Ukrainian crisis had been playing out and
Yeah.
how the international community had reacted compared to to other crises we've seen. I mean, what's been taking place in Palestine, we've seen what has taken place in many other countries, and we see the hypocrisy and the sense of urgency with which the international community has reacted to Ukraine. And looking at countries like Sri Lanka, I'm not too sure, and I have serious doubts as to we're going to get a similar reaction. I mean, it is also a country in crisis, perhaps for different reasons, but it is a country in crisis.
Yeah, I think that was one of the common complaints that we have had, is that, generally what the West or the high income countries' interests sort of play out in the global media, and that tends to sort of be monopolized over the airwaves, and also the policy, global governance policy decisions, and so on. And it's sad because Sri Lanka's, say for an example, the protest has been going on for months and largely peaceful. It would only reach the media when there's dramatic, when they topple the barricades or take over the presidential secretariat or so on. And then people think, oh, this is this violent protest, which it has not been largely. So that's one of the problems. The other problem is that, addressing the international community challenge is that, largely our global governance system also needs some introspection, not just around how we respond to crisis in the world, but also how we respond to, say, for an example, a global crisis that affects everyone, such as the pandemic and the economic crisis and so on. Because always the high income country interest plays out, and there is no repercussion for their lack of responsibility or empathy, and so on. So that's another challenge for the world to sort of recognize that we need to change our value system, and that needs to be reflected in the global governance system as well. I just want to touch on the diaspora as well. I think Sri Lankan diaspora has been more so than before, probably for the first time, coordinated protests against Gotabaya Rajapaksa and Ranil Wickremesinghe around the world. So I think there is this recognition, like Donovan mentioned, that we all need to get involved, and we all need to call for accountability within the country. So I'm hoping that that recognition continues, and that pressure continues to build, so that Ranil Wickremesinghe would step down, and the constitutional changes and the intermediary government can sort of take over and tide us through these difficult times.
Yes, and also, Donovan, the pressure needs to be maintained. It's got to be a sustainable campaign.
Yeah, I think both the campaign, and I'm worrying about the humanitarian aspect, particularly because there's a global cost of living crisis. So we saw now it's bad, but if you recall when there was the 2007, 2008 recession, in the global recession, which was basically in Europe and the US because of the property bubble, and thereafter, how the West rolled back the global humanitarian assistance in the continent of Africa and elsewhere, and how difficult it may be to be able to get this help, especially because societies have become quite selfish. You may have a society in Europe, saying, "No, we are going through such tough times, we can't help." And populism as politics will be, you want to go and help Sri Lanka, but you can't help the railway strike in the UK, whichever it is, etc. So there must be an appeal done from people to people and not just governments. Sri Lankans and the diaspora, that's where it becomes important. We've seen the success of Gift of the Givers within our country, and how it has helped in other countries. I think this is quite important, because the way politics is played, it's played as a game that anything goes as long as you can get power.
Yeah.
And people don't matter. I mean, it's a horrible Game of Thrones thing that we're in. Politics, which is supposed to be about people, has become about anything besides people, and that's horrible. So I think that's what's quite important, is to try and get that aid and the humanitarian aid in a way that is not just dependent, and so that you can force the discussions in the UN and ASEAN and so forth, and even maybe hopefully European parliamentarians in the EU raise it as well. India has to be to wake up, because refugees are they've already started to come, right? Refugees are going to be coming into India, and they won't be able to stop that. So it's very, very important that India starts to say, hey, look, what is going to happen, but in a way that Sri Lankans don't lose their own country. I think that's quite important, and that's why the leadership vacuum becomes, again, if you don't do something to create some type of leadership there, whichever external which is supposedly helping is coming to take over, in one way or the and vassal states never work out. They never do. They don't last forever, and they cause problems, more problems later. So I just want to. That's why I want to raise this: is that the humanitarian aid mustn't be only based on governments. There have to be people to people. They have to be able to push governments to work. Because I'm really worried nowadays that given this global crisis, cost of living crisis, it's difficult for people to think how to help somebody else when you yourself are in a difficult situation. And Sri Lanka it's the worst time to have a crisis. It's the worst time to have a crisis, but because there's crisis all over, in a way, manner of speaking, they're just different, degrees of it. Yeah. So we need to stand together as human beings. I think that's quite important. Hopefully I'm not sounding too
certainly
liberal.
do.
Yeah, but that's the
Yes,
truth.
Donovan. I see we've got about 4 minutes. Shashika, just some final thoughts in about 2 minutes.
Yeah, I think just to, because the segment is what's next for Sri Lanka, I think what is urgent is for the political leadership to stabilize. So that includes resignations that I spoke about earlier from Gotabaya and Ranil, and then for the intermediary government to form. And the other thing is we do need to look at the crisis that we have, the food, education, and the essential medicines crisis, and address that immediately, and go into the sort of the economic stabilizations with IMF and so on. And I think we also, as a country, will need to look at sustainable change as a society, including constitutional change, to sort of create an environment where these things do not happen again. So that's what I see as what's next for Sri Lanka.
Well, thank you for that, Shashika. Donovan, final thoughts.
No, thank you. I think Shashika has generally covered me on the way forward, the constitution, leadership, etc. And all we can say is that, Shashika, I hope your family is safe and that in Sri Lanka. And we all would hope that the enthusiasm that you talked about, that this is a crisis just for better change, I think that's what we want. And we will stand by in ways that we hope that we can be able to help as much as we're going through difficulty here as well. Because as I said, human beings need to remember they are human beings before all these other labels we put on ourselves. And that's what we have seemed to have forgotten for way too long.
Well, to you, Shashika Bandara and Donovan Williams, would like to thank both of you for coming on, for being part of the panel discussion this evening here on Salam Media. We wish you well, and especially to you, Shashika, like Donovan mentioned, safety for your loved ones. I'm sure you've got many friends out there, family as well. We wish them well, and we trust and hope that sanity will prevail at the end of the day, and sooner this crisis is over, and the sooner the country can get back onto its feet and get back to normality, it will be better for each and everyone. So all the best to both of you. But once again, my sincere thanks, my gratitude to both of you for coming on and being part of the discussion tonight. All the best. Take care.
Cheers. Thank you. Thank you, Shashika.
Shashika Bandara, PhD student, global policy, health policy, McGill University, and social commentator Donovan Williams with us this evening on the way forward for Sri Lanka. And with that, it's time for me to sign off. Once again, it's been an absolute pleasure being in your company on Wednesday nights with myself, Inayat Wadi. And until we meet again, from myself and the team, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.